A harsh metallic slam rang out across the dusty parking lot of the Taos County Animal Shelter. Then another, then another, each one louder than the last, each one more desperate, like a prisoner beating against the walls of a cell that was shrinking around him. Inside a steel transport kennel bolted to the back of a county truck, a 90-pound German shepherd was destroying himself. His name, according to the paperwork no one had bothered to read, was Ghost. He was gray and white, built like a weapon, and right now every ounce of that powerful body was being hurled against a metal door that would not open. His paws were bleeding, his chest was slick with foam and drool. His bark had gone beyond sound. It was a scream, a raw, shredded animal scream that echoed off the concrete walls of the shelter and carried across the empty road into the sagebrush flats beyond. On the ground beside the truck, a man named Ray Ontiveros sat clutching his right forearm. Blood seeped through the thick canvas sleeve of his county uniform, running down between his fingers and dripping onto the gravel in dark, irregular spots. His face was the color of old paper. His eyes were wide, locked on the kennel, and what lived inside them was not anger. Not yet. First came the fear, the pure, involuntary, biological terror of a man who had felt teeth sink into his flesh, and understood in that single white-hot instant that the animal attached to those teeth intended to take his arm off at the elbow. The anger came second. It always does. That's it, Ray said through clenched teeth. His voice was tight, vibrating with pain and adrenaline. It's done. I want it euthanized. Right now. Not in the kennels. Not tomorrow. Now. Tom Yazzie, the shelter director, stood 3 feet away with the expression of a man watching a building burn and knowing there was nothing inside worth saving. Tom was Navajo, early 60s, with a salt and pepper ponytail pulled low and the kind of face that had been carved by decades of wind and difficult decisions. He had spent 20 years as a captain in the tribal police before retiring to run the shelter, and in that time he had learned that the world divided itself neatly into problems you could solve and problems you could only manage. The dog in the kennel he was fairly certain belonged to the second category. "Ray, are you all right?" Tom said. His voice was level, professional, the voice of a man who had talked people off ledges and out of standoffs and through the worst nights of their lives. Ray did not answer the question. He answered a different one. "You saw it, Tom. You saw what it did. That thing is not a dog. It's a weapon. I want the needle in it before sundown, or I swear I will handle this myself." Inside the kennel, Ghost hit the door again. The entire truck rocked on its springs. The sound was sickening, wet, heavy. The sound of bone and muscle meeting steel with nothing held back. He was not attacking. He was trying to escape. He was trying to claw his way out of a box that smelled like diesel and fear and every terrible thing that had ever happened to him. And he was failing, and his failure was making him more desperate, and his desperation was making him more violent, and the violence was confirming everything Ray Ontiveros believed about him. This is how it works. This is how the cycle closes. A scared animal acts scared, and the world calls it dangerous, and by the time anyone thinks to ask why it was scared in the first place, the needle is already in the vein, and the question no longer matters. 50 yards down the road on the gravel shoulder opposite the shelter's chain-link gate, a truck sat idling. It was an old Ford vintage 1994 gray with rust creeping along the rocker panels and a single diagonal crack running across the rear window that had never been repaired. The engine was running. The driver's hands were on the wheel. His foot was on the brake. He was about to drive away. His name was Caleb Mercer, and he had not spoken to another human being in nearly 3 months. Before that, the gap had been 5 months. Before that, almost a year. He had been living like this for 19 years, alone, deliberate, silent. Up on the mountain in a one-room cabin he had rebuilt with his own hands from the bones of an abandoned forestry station at 9,000 feet in the Sangre de Cristo Range north of Taos. No grid power, no internet, no cell signal, one landline telephone that had not rung since he installed it. He came down 4 times a year to buy supplies. Flour, salt, coffee, kerosene, fuel. Anything beyond that was luxury, and luxury was complication, and complication was the thing he had spent 2 decades climbing above. He was 54 years old, tall, lean in the way of men who live on physical labor and self-imposed rationing. Brown hair long enough to brush his collar heavy with gray at the temples. A dense beard that was not quite wild, but was certainly not maintained. He wore what he always wore: cracked leather work boots, faded jeans, a red and dark navy plaid flannel shirt under an old brown leather jacket that had seen more weather than most houses, a cap pulled low over his eyes. He did not look at the shelter when he drove past it. He never did. It was his least favorite part of the drive into town, this concrete box of endings, and he had trained himself over the years to fix his gaze on the opposite side of the road, on the sagebrush, on the distant mesa, on anything that was not this place where animals came to disappear. He would look away and press the gas and be past it in seconds. Today, the sound stopped him. It came through the closed windows of the mom, and it hit something inside him that was not a thought. It was older than thought. It was instinct, not the usual sad yelping. This was percussive, rhythmic, a large body throwing itself against metal. Then a man's sharp cry of pain against every reflex he had spent 19 years building. Caleb Mercer slowed his truck. He pulled onto the shoulder. He saw the two men. He saw the blood. He saw the kennel shaking on the back of the county truck. Turn around. The voice in his head was immediate and absolute. The voice that had kept him alive, kept him isolated, kept him safe for 19 years. Not your problem, not your world. Drive away. He put the truck in gear. His foot moved to the accelerator. He physically turned his head toward the road, ready to merge back onto the asphalt. He would go to the feed store, buy his supplies, load the truck, and be back on his mountain before noon. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. 4 times a year, no variation, no deviation, no contact. He took one last look in his side mirror, and his foot came off the pedal. Something was wrong with the dog. Not wrong in the way Ray Ontiveros meant. Wrong in a way that only a very specific kind of person would recognize. Wrong in a way that made the hair on the back of Caleb Mercer's neck stand straight up, and his blood go cold, and the New Mexico morning dissolve around him like a photograph thrown into fire. The dog's eyes were not narrowed in aggression. They were wide, blown open, the whites showing all the way around the iris like the eyes of a horse in a burning barn. His ears were not forward, not challenging, not asserting dominance. They were pinned flat against his skull, pressed so tight they nearly disappeared into the thick ruff of fur at his neck. His body was trembling, not with rage, with a deep, cellular, vibrating terror that had no bottom. But it was the head. The head was the thing that stopped Caleb's heart. Between lunges, the dog was not looking at the men. He was not looking at the door. His head snapped up, muzzle pointing toward the sky, and his eyes swept the roof line of the shelter. Swept the empty blue horizon. Swept the tree line to the west. He was scanning, searching for something above him, as if the threat was not in front of him, but was coming from the sky. Caleb killed the engine. The sudden silence in the cab rang in his ears like a bell. He sat there for 3 seconds, maybe 4, and in those seconds, 19 years of isolation and silence and carefully maintained distance from the human race collapsed. Because he had seen this before. He had seen it exactly once. And the last time he saw it, 7 seconds later, the world exploded. The smell of diesel and hot dust filled his nostrils. The bright New Mexico morning vanished. It was 2004, Kandahar province, Afghanistan. The heat was 120 degrees and it sat on him like a wet wool blanket. He was walking point with his K9 partner 20 feet ahead of him, a magnificent black and tan German shepherd named Ranger who had been working the scent line for half a mile through hard-pan desert toward a mud brick compound. Ranger stopped. No bark, no growl. He froze in place like someone had hit the pause button on the world. His eyes went wide, his ears pinned flat, and his head snapped up and swept the rooftops. Scanning, searching, warning. Caleb had grabbed his radio. Ranger is alerting. High threat. He is scanning the rooftops. A click from the radio. The whistle of incoming mortar. Then the world ended. He was standing by his truck. The New Mexico sun was warm on his face. The dust on the gravel was red, not brown. He was not in Kandahar. He was in Taos. But his hands were shaking, and his breath was coming in short, shallow gasps, and he could taste copper and dust and burning fuel on the back of his tongue. The dog in the kennel lunged again. His cry was not a bark. It was the sound of a mind trapped inside a memory it could not escape. It was the precise, specialized, unmistakable post-traumatic stress response of a Doi who had been trained for war, a god who had learned through repetition and violence in the particular hell of combat that death comes from above. Caleb Mercer had been a military K-9 handler for 14 years. He had lived, breathed, slept, and nearly died with working dogs on 3 continents. He knew their language the way a musician knows scales. And what he was hearing from this dog was not aggression. It was a distress signal, a veteran screaming for help in a language that no one around him could understand. Not your problem, he said to himself. His voice was hoarse. The words were true. They had been true for 19 years. He had come to this mountain to escape exactly this: the chaos, the pain, the responsibility, the terrible weight of holding another life in your hands and knowing that your hands were not steady enough, not good enough, not fast enough. He had killed his partner. That was the truth he carried. He had been tired. They all had 20 hours into a patrol in heat that could kill a man standing still. Ranger had alerted, Caleb had seen the signal, and he had hesitated. 1 second, maybe 2. A part of him had thought maybe he's just hot, maybe he's tired, maybe it's nothing. And in that hesitation, in that tiny crack of doubt, he had made the wrong call. He had sent Ranger forward instead of pulling back. He had given the command that walked his best friend, his partner, his other half into the blast radius of an improvised explosive device. 7 seconds later, Ranger was dead, and Caleb Mercer began the long, slow process of erasing himself from the world. He put his hand on the gear shift. He would drive away. He would go to the store. He would buy his flour and his salt and his coffee, and he would climb back up to 9,000 feet and close the door and sit in the silence and let the years continue to pass one by one, like cards dealt from a deck that would never run out. The dog screamed again, and Caleb opened the door of his truck and stepped out into the morning. Wait, it was the first word he had spoken to a stranger in nearly 2 decades. The sound of his own voice shocked him. It came out thin, rough, cracked from disuse, like a door being opened in a house that had been sealed for years. Wait! Ray froze his hand halfway to a catchpole leaning against the shelter wall. Tom Yazzie turned his full attention to the stranger. He knew this man. Everyone in Taos knew him, or rather, knew of him. Caleb, the mountain man, the ghost who bought his supplies in bulk and spoke to no one and disappeared back into the peaks like smoke. In 5 years as director, Tom had never heard him speak. "Can I help you?" Tom said, his voice defaulting to the practiced calm of a man who had spent 2 decades talking to people in crisis. Caleb was not looking at Tom. His eyes were locked on the transport kennel. The shepherd inside had paused, his flanks heaving, his chest slick. "The dog," Caleb said. His voice was a low rasp like gravel being poured. "Where did he come from?" "Owner surrendered this morning," Tom said, stepping slightly between Caleb and the agitated Ray. "Said he was vicious, uncontrollable. Judging by what just happened to my officer, I would say there is some truth to that." Ray, clutching his bleeding arm, spat onto the gravel. "Some truth. That thing tried to take my arm off Tom. It needs to be put down before it hurts someone else. Today. I want it done today." Caleb did not look at Ray. He had not looked at Ray once. His eyes were fixed on the kennel, on the bleeding paws, on the trembling body, on the ghost of a dog he had loved more than any person alive. "He's not vicious," Caleb said. It was not an opinion. It was a diagnosis delivered with the quiet authority of a man who had spent his life reading the bodies and minds of animals in the most extreme conditions on Earth. "He's terrified." Tom let out a slow breath. He had heard this before. From volunteers, from well-meaning visitors, from people who saw potential in every lost cause, impossibility, in every pair of sad eyes. Terrified. Vicious. From this side of the fence, those two things look exactly the same. The silence stretched. Caleb looked from the ball to Tom. He looked at the finality in Tom's dark eyes, the fury in Ray's pale ones, and the pure white terror in the shepherd's amber gaze. He felt the old familiar weight settle on him like a physical thing. The weight of responsibility, the weight of another life in the balance, the weight he had spent 19 years climbing a mountain to escape. "Let me try," Caleb said. The words came out before he could stop them. They did not feel like a decision. They felt like gravity. Ray let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Try what? Get yourself killed. That dog will rip your throat out, old man." Tom just looked at him. "Try what exactly? What do you do, Mr. Mercer?" Caleb's jaw tightened. He had not said the words out loud to another human being since the day he buried his uniform in a footlocker and drove until the roads ran out. The admission felt like tearing stitches from a wound that had never healed. "I was a handler," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "K9. 2 letters, 2 syllables. And the air around them changed. Ray's scoffing died in his throat. Tom Yazzie, the 20-year police veteran, suddenly saw the stranger in front of him in an entirely different light. He saw the way Caleb stood. Not aggressive, but perfectly balanced weight distributed evenly, hands loose at his sides. He saw the quiet authority that had been there all along, hidden under the beard and the silence and the 19 years of deliberate isolation. "K9, Tom repeated, tasting the word. He made a decision. "Ray, go to the urgent care. Get that arm stitched and documented. That is an order, not a suggestion. But the dog, Tom, I want it. I will handle the dog. Go." Tom's voice carried the steel of a man who was used to being obeyed. Ray glared at Caleb with a hatred that was not really hatred, but was fear wearing a mask. He turned and stalked to his truck, slammed the door, and drove away in a cloud of dust toward the clinic. Tom turned back to Caleb. "He's right about one thing. It's a risk. I cannot let you into that kennel. My insurance, my county board, they would shut me down in a heartbeat." Caleb nodded. "I don't need to go in. He's still in the transport crate. Just leave him. Give me space. And a stool." Tom blinked. "A stool. A simple wooden stool. Something I can sit on." Inside the shelter's small front office, Elena Sandoval had been watching the entire scene through the window blinds. She was 27 years old with dark hair pinned up in a twist that was already falling apart by 9 in the morning and brown eyes that held the kind of earnest, stubborn idealism that this job had not yet managed to kill. She was the veterinary technician and intake coordinator, and she had spent the last 20 minutes with her hand pressed over her mouth, horrified by the violence, dreading what came next. The needle, the quiet walk to the cold room, the paperwork. Now she watched completely baffled as her boss walked to the storage shed and came back carrying an old 3-legged milking stool. She watched as the stranger, this Caleb Mercer, this mountain ghost that everyone in town whispered about, but no one had ever heard speak, took the stool and carried it to a spot on the gravel about 10 feet from the transport kennel on the back of the truck. He did not face the dog. He placed the stool down, sat and angled his body so that he was partially turned away, offering his side rather than a direct confrontational stare. The shepherd, who had been watching the exchange in tense, exhausted silence, renewed his panic. The new human was close. Too close. He began to bark a deep, explosive sound that seemed to shake the truck on its springs, and he lunged at the bars, his body slamming into the steel with a wet, heavy thud. Caleb did not flinch. He did not look up. From the deep inner pocket of his old brown leather jacket, he pulled out a very old paperback book. The cover was missing. The pages were yellow and soft with age. He opened it to a marked page and he began to read, or rather, he appeared to read. His eyes tracked the words on the page, but every nerve in his body, every sense he possessed was tuned entirely to the animal 10 feet away. He was not ignoring the dog. He was doing something far more difficult. He was outlasting it. Elena turned to Tom, who had come to stand beside her at the window. "What is he doing?" she whispered. "That dog is going to give itself a heart attack." Tom's eyes were narrow focused, watching the scene with the intensity of a man who recognized something he had only read about but never witnessed. "He's not ignoring it," Tom said quietly. "Watch." The shepherd's rhythm broke. He lunged, he barked, he hit to the metal door, and he was met with nothing. No shouting, no catch pole rattling against the bars, no threat. Just the scent of a calm man and the sound of a page turning in the wind. He lunged again, stopped, stared. The man turned a page. The dog made a sound Elena had never heard before. Half bark, half whine. A sound of pure confusion. He was being addressed in a language he did not understand. The language of absolute neutrality. The language of a presence that was neither threat nor comfort. The language of a man who was simply immovably there. The barking faded to a low rumble. The rumble faded to panting. Ghost slid down onto his belly for the first time since he had arrived at the shelter, his sides heaving, his tongue lolling, his muscles still wound tight, but the blind panic draining out of him like water from a cracked vessel. His head stayed up, his ears swiveled, his amber eyes locked onto the strange, quiet man who was breaking every rule the world had ever taught him about humans. Caleb sat there for 1 hour. The sun climbed, the shadows shortened. He turned 3 pages. The only sounds were the distant highway, the occasional bark from the main kennel building, and the slow, steady rhythm of a dog learning for the first time in months that silence was possible. Then Caleb closed his book. He placed it back in his pocket. He stood his movements unhurried, and the instantly tensed, scrambling to his feet, a growl starting deep in his chest. Caleb did not look at him. He picked up the stool, his back still mostly to the animal, and walked to the office. Tom was waiting for him outside. That was something Tom said. He was not sure what else to say. What now? Caleb looked past him up toward the mountains. His mountains. The peaks that had been his refuge in his prison for 19 years. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said. He walked to his truck, climbed in, started the engine, drove away without looking back. And in the transport kennel Ghost, the gray and white shepherd, who had spent the last 5 days being dragged, beaten, starved, and thrown away like broken equipment, lay down in true silence for the first time since the man who was supposed to protect him had started using his fists instead. His eyes never left the spot where the quiet stranger had been sitting. His nose still held the scent. Leather, pine smoke, old paper. And underneath all of it, something the dog recognized in the way that only a creature who has lived it can recognize it. The scent of a man who was also afraid, also broken, also alone. The scent of someone who understood. Elena Sandoval waited until the old truck disappeared around the bend before she opened the intake file. The man who had surrendered Ghost that morning had thrown a plastic sleeve of documents onto the reception desk and called them useless garbage. Elena, who read everything because reading everything was the only power she had in a job that made her feel powerless most days, had scanned the microchip embedded in the dog's neck. The result came back restricted, linked to a private security contractor. But the papers inside the plastic sleeve, those were something else entirely. She pulled them out now, her hands steady, even though her heart was not. The Department of Defense seal, a DD, Form 2209, the Military Veterinary Medical Record, a discharge certificate, K9IDG 7782, name Ghost, classification military working dog, multi-purpose canine, discharge 2023, Deployments: Bagram, Afghanistan. Al-Tanf, Syria. Ghost was not a stray. Ghost was not a vicious animal who had snapped without reason. Ghost was a soldier, a veteran who had served his country in 2 combat zones, who had been discharged and passed along to a private contractor and then to a civilian who had beaten him until the war inside his head became the only reality he knew. Elena placed the documents in a separate drawer, locked it. She would wait for the right moment. Because in her experience, the right moment never came when you were ready for it. It came when the person who needed to hear the truth was finally broken enough to listen. She looked out the window one more time. The parking lot was empty. The kennel was quiet. Somewhere up on the mountain, an old truck was climbing through the aspens carrying a man who had not planned to stop, had not planned to speak, had not planned to feel anything at all today. But he had stopped. He had spoken. And tomorrow he said he would come back. Elena Sandoval had worked at this shelter for 2 years. She had learned not to hope. Hope was expensive and this job paid in grief. But standing in the quiet office with the locked drawer and the silent kennel and the memory of a man sitting perfectly still while the world screamed around him, she allowed herself just for a moment to wonder if maybe this time would be different. And in his kennel, Ghost slept. Not deeply, not peacefully, but he slept. And in his sleep, his nose twitched, cataloging and filing, and remembering the one scent from this terrible day that had not carried the smell of danger. The scent of the man on the stool, the man who did not move, the man who simply, quietly, impossibly stayed. The next morning, Caleb Mercer's truck pulled into the same spot on the gravel shoulder at 6:47. The engine ticked as it cooled. The sun was just clearing the Sangre de Cristo peaks, throwing long orange light across the valley floor and painting the concrete walls of the shelter in colors they did not deserve. Tom Yazzie was standing by the office door with a tin mug of black coffee. He watched the truck park. He watched the tall, lean figure step out. Same boots, same jacket, same cap, pulled low. He gave a single short nod. Caleb nodded back. The entire exchange lasted less than 2 seconds and contained no words, and it was the most communication Caleb had willingly engaged in with another person in longer than he could remember. Tom had moved Ghost overnight. The transport kennel on the truck was temporary, and the truck itself needed to go back into service. So he had transferred the Shepherd to a secure concrete run in the quarantine wing, an isolated block at the back of the shelter property with its own entrance and heavy chain-link gates reinforced with steel frames. It was the place they put dogs that could not be near other dogs. Dogs that bit, dogs that were too sick, dogs that were waiting to die. The 3-leg milking stool was sitting just inside the entrance to the quarantine wing, right where Tom had left it. Caleb picked it up and walked down the concrete hallway. His boots made no sound. The air smelled of bleach and wet concrete and the faint, sharp undercurrent of animal fear that never fully washed out of places like this, no matter how much you scrubbed. Ghost knew he was coming before he turned the corner. The dog had heard the truck. He had heard the engine he was already learning to recognize, and the sound had triggered a response that was not quite panic and not quite hope, but lived somewhere in the trembling space between the two. By the time Caleb appeared at the end of the hallway, Ghost was already on his feet, already pressed against the back wall of the concrete run, already producing a low, continuous growl that vibrated in his chest like a motor idling in a machine that did not know whether to run or to fight. Caleb set the stool down 10 feet from the gate. Same distance as yesterday, same angle, same partial turn of the body offering his side, never his front. He sat. He pulled out the old paperback. He opened it. Ghost erupted. The deep, explosive barking filled the concrete hallway and bounced off every wall, amplifying layering, until it sounded like there were 6 dogs in the run instead of 1. He lunged at the chain link, his teeth snapping against the metal, his paws slamming into the gate with enough force to rattle the frame and its bolts. It was a display of raw, desperate power that would have sent most people stumbling backward and reaching for a weapon. Caleb turned a page. 20 minutes. That was how long it took. 20 minutes of sustained fury, of barking so intense that Ghost's voice began to shred at the edge of lunges that grew shorter and less committed as the dog's exhausted body began to override his terrified mind. 20 minutes and then the rhythm broke. The barking stuttered, stopped, started again weaker, stopped. Ghost backed away from the gate. His paws left faint bloody prints on the concrete. He retreated to the far corner and lay down his head. Up his ears, swiveling, his amber eyes locked on the man who would not react, would not threaten, would not leave. Caleb noted the time in his head. Yesterday it had been 45 minutes before the first break. Today 20. The trajectory was everything. He sat for 3 more hours. He turned pages he did not read. He breathed slowly and evenly, and he let his calm radiate outward like heat from a stove filling the hallway, filling the run, offering the dog nothing to fight against and therefore nothing to fear. At 10:30 he closed the book, stood up, walked away without looking back. Ghost watched him go, and when the sound of the old truck's engine faded into the distance, the dog lowered his head onto his paws and released a long, slow breath that sounded almost like surrender. The third day, the fourth, the routine held. Caleb arrived with the sun. Ghost exploded in his ritual of terror and defensive fury. Caleb sat. The fury burned itself out against the man's immovable stillness, faster each day, shorter each day, the half-life of trauma decaying under the patient radiation of a calm that asked nothing and promised nothing and simply refused to end. By the third day, the initial explosion lasted only 5 minutes. When Ghost retreated to his corner, he put his head on his paws, and though every muscle in his body remained coiled, ready to spring, something in the quality of his stillness had changed. He was no longer just panicked. He was frustrated, confused. He was waiting for the next step, for the threat that always eventually came, for the hand or the boot or the chain that would confirm everything his broken mind believed about humans. The threat did not come. Instead, on the afternoon of the third day, the man on the stool did something new. Caleb closed his book and placed it on the concrete floor beside the stool. He did not stand. He did not move toward the gate. He simply sat, his hands resting on his knees, and he looked at the dog. Not directly into his eyes. That was a challenge, a provocation, a declaration of dominance that would have undone 3 days of work in an instant. He looked at the dog's ears, at the space between them, at the broad, intelligent forehead of an animal who had been built and trained and shaped for a purpose that the world had used up and thrown away. And then Caleb spoke. Seats. The word was barely louder than a breath, a low, rough murmur that drifted down the concrete hallway like smoke. It was not English, it was German, the standard command language of military working dogs chosen decades ago because its hard consonants carry clearly through chaos and its foreignness. To most civilians, prevents accidental commands from bystanders. Ghost's head snapped up off his paws. His ears, which had been pinned flat against his skull in a posture of chronic fear, shot forward and upward, swiveling like satellite dishes trying to lock onto a signal they had not received in a very long time. He did not sit. He scrambled to his feet, confused electric, his body vibrating with a recognition that came from somewhere deeper than memory, somewhere in the bedrock of his training beneath the layers of abuse and terror and displacement. A door had just been knocked on. He knew that word. Plots, Caleb murmured, down. The word ached in his chest. He had not spoken German commands since the last time he said them to Ranger. Since the belly of a C-130 transport aircraft, the floor vibrating beneath them. Ranger's warm, solid body pressed against his leg, the two of them breathing in sync the way they always did before a mission. Plots. And Ranger would lower himself to the deck with his chin on his paws and his eyes locked on Caleb's face, and in that look was everything. Trust, purpose, love, the holy trinity of the working dog. Leave, Caleb whispered. Stay. He was not commanding Ghost. He was communing with a ghost of his own. He was speaking to the soldier he knew was trapped inside that terrified animal, using the language they both understood, the language of a world that had built them and used them and then left them alone with what it had done to them. Ghost paced, he whined. The sounds of his trauma fought with the muscle memory of his training, two tectonic plates grinding against each other inside a single shaking body. He heard the words. He knew the words. But the words came from a time before the pain, and the distance between then and now was a canyon he did not know how to cross. From the small front office, Elena Sandoval watched through the window. Her coffee had gone cold in her hands 20 minutes ago, and she had not noticed. She had seen Caleb's strange routine over the past 3 days, the sitting, the silence, the book. But today she heard the words. She saw the dog's immediate electric response, the ears snapping forward, the full body vibration of recognition. She understood what she was witnessing. She was watching a language being spoken that she did not speak, but whose meaning was unmistakable. She poured down her mug. She pulled 2 others from the shelf and filled them from the pot. Then she walked outside. Caleb heard her footsteps on the gravel, and his entire body went rigid. He existed in a fragile space right now, a space calibrated by 3 days of patience and precision, and any intrusion was a variable he could not control. His shoulders tightened, his jaw set. Mr. Mercer, he did not turn. Sir, I brought you some coffee. You haven't moved in hours. He turned slowly. He saw the young woman, dark hair falling out of his twist, brown eyes that were white and kind, and filled with a concern that was not pity. He recognized the difference. Pity looks down. Concern looks across. He hesitated. Then he took the mug. Thank you. Elena nodded toward the kennel where Ghost was standing motionless, every sense locked onto the quiet exchange happening just outside his gate. I heard you, she said. The German, I think you are right about him. And I think I know why you are right. She reached into the pocket of her scrubs and pulled out a folded clear plastic sleeve. The same sleeve the previous owner had thrown on her desk and called useless garbage. He was surrendered 5 days ago, Elena said, her voice dropping. The man who brought him in was cruel. He dragged him by a choke chain. He told us the dog was broken and uncontrollable, and that if we did not take him, he would shoot him. We had no choice. She took a breath. He threw these papers at me like they were trash. But I read them. I always read them. I scanned his microchip. It came back restricted, linked to a private military contractor. But these papers, Mr. Mercer, these are his discharge documents. She held them out. Caleb's hands, which had been steady as stone for 3 straight days, developed a slight tremor. He took the plastic sleeve. Through the clear material, he saw the Department of Defense seal. He saw the DD Form 209, the canine medical record that he himself had filled out hundreds of times for dozens of dogs in places whose names he had tried to forget. He saw the discharge certificate, K9 ID G7782, name Ghost. Classification, military working dog, multi-purpose canine. Discharged 2023. Deployments, Bagram, Afghanistan. Al-Tanef, Syria. He was a soldier, Elena whispered. Tears were building in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She had learned long ago that tears in this job were a luxury you saved for the drive home. He served 2 combat zones, and when they were done with him, they passed him to a contractor who passed him to a civilian who beat him until he broke. Ray, the officer who got bitten, he ran the man's plates afterward. 3 prior animal neglect charges. He beat a decorated veteran, Mr. Mercer. He beat a hero. Caleb stared at the papers. A cold, slow, burning anger began to build in his chest. Not the hot, explosive kind that makes a man do something stupid, but the deep, geological kind that reshapes landscapes over time. He had seen this before. Military working dogs were heroes on the battlefield. They saved lives. They took bullets. They walked point into buildings and compounds and tunnels where no human being wanted to go first. And then if they developed behavioral problems, if the war broke them, the way it broke the men and women who served beside them, they were discharged and passed along again until they ended up in a place like this, in a concrete box, waiting for a needle. He looked at Ghost. The dog was watching them from the corner of his run, still trembling, but his head was high and his ears were forward and his eyes were tracking the plastic sleeve in Caleb's hands, as if he could smell what was inside it, as if he could smell his own history. This was not just This was not just a mirror of Ranger. This was one of his own. The feeling settled on Caleb like a physical weight, like a rucksack being strapped to shoulders that had been bare for too long. The weight of connection, the weight of obligation, the weight of a responsibility he had been running from for 19 years, and that had just walked back into his life wearing fur and trauma and a pair of amber eyes that held the same look Caleb saw every time he caught his own reflection in the window of his dark cabin. He handed the mug back to Elena. "Thank you, ma'am, for the coffee and for this." He walked to his truck. Elena thought he was leaving. His rigid shoulders, his long stride, the stiffness in his back, they all read as defeat. But he did not open the driver's door. He opened the passenger side. From a small cooler on the floorboard, he pulled a foil-wrapped packet. He walked back to the kennel run. Ghost tensed. His growl returned low and constant, the engine of his fear always idling. Caleb knelt. The concrete was cold through the denim of his jeans. He did not throw the food. He did not try to push it through the gate with a pole or a stick. He spoke in a tone so low it was almost subvocal, the tone of a handler speaking to a dog in a hide site at 2 in the morning when the enemy is 50 yards away, and the only thing between your team and detection is the discipline of the animal pressed against your chest. "Guter Junge, das ist für dich. Good boy, this is for you." He slid the packet, which contained high-value air-dried liver that he had prepared himself from a deer he had taken in the fall just inside the gate. He placed it on the concrete with the care of a man setting down something holy. Then he withdrew. He stood. He walked back to his stool. He sat down. He opened his book. He gave the dog the only thing that mattered: distance, dignity, choice. Ghost stared at the packet. He stared at Caleb. He looked at the packet, his black nose twitch processing, the scent categorizing it, running it against every memory he had of food and hands, and the terrible things that usually connected the two. He was starving. That was obvious. His ribs showed through his coat like fingers under a blanket. But the fear was stronger than the hunger. It always is in the beginning. He paced, he whined. He looked at the liver, and then at the man, and then at the liver, and then at the man, and the standoff between his stomach and his terror played out in real time on the concrete floor of a county shelter in northern New Mexico, while the sun moved across the sky and the man on the stool turned pages he did not read. 2 hours. The standoff lasted 2 hours. Caleb stood. He closed his book. He collected his stool. He walked to his truck. He did not look back. The next morning, the first thing he checked was the gate. The fall packet was gone. In its place were tiny shredded fragments, licked so clean they looked like they had been polished. Every molecule of liver had been consumed. Every trace of the offering had been accepted. Caleb nodded once and sat down. 5 days. 5 days of the new routine. A fragile peace built on silence and dried liver and the glacial accumulation of something that was not yet trust, but was perhaps the memory of what trust had once felt like. Each morning Caleb arrived. Each morning Ghost was waiting, no longer detonating in panic, but standing rigid at the back of his run, producing a low vibrating whine that hummed in his chest like a current running through a wire. Caleb moved the stool closer. 6 feet from the gate now, then 5, then 4. Well inside the boundary that Ghost had drawn in his own mind, the invisible perimeter, beyond which all humans were threats and all contact was pain. And each day Caleb added a new element to the ritual. He would sit book in hand, and slowly over the course of an hour, he would extend his left hand and rest it palm out against the chain link, fingers spread, palm flat, offering nothing but scent and stillness. Ghost's reaction was a war fought entirely inside his own body. He would creep toward the gate, his belly so low to the concrete that his chest fur dragged on the floor, his ears flat, his eyes wide. He would stop 2 feet away, then 1 foot, then 6 inches. His black nose would extend toward the chain link twitching, reading the story written on Caleb's skin. Leather and pine smoke, and coffee, and the metallic ghost of old fear, and beneath all of it, the warm mammalian baseline of a body at rest, a body that was not preparing to strike. Then his own terror would seize him like a hand around his throat, and he would skitter backward to the corner, and the distance would reset, and the whole slow, terrible approach would begin again. Caleb never moved. He was a statue, a monument to patience erected in a hallway that smelled of bleach and sorrow. On the 6th morning of this second phase, the advance went further than it ever had. Ghost crept to the gate. His nose was almost touching the wire. Caleb could feel the dog's breath on his knuckles, warm and rapid, and he could smell the dog's fear, sharp and chemical, the smell of cortisol and adrenaline baking off an animal whose nervous system had been running at redline for so long, it no longer knew any other speed. Ghost's tongue appeared, pink, tentative. It darted out and touched the wire where Caleb's hand rested, not his skin, the metal between them, the barrier. He licked the wire once quickly and then jerked backward, as if the act of gentleness had burned him, as if his own capacity for something other than violence had frightened him more than any threat ever could. He scrambled to the corner. He lay down. He stared at the man with an expression that Elena, watching from the office window, would later describe as the most human look she had ever seen on an animal's face. It was confusion. It was longing. It was the terrible exhaustion of a creature who wanted desperately to cross a bridge, but could not remember how to take the first step. Caleb let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like an hour. His hand stayed on the wire. A silent promise. I am here. I am not leaving. Take all the time you need. He stayed for 3 more hours. He did not move his hand. That evening, the shelter emptied. The volunteers left. Tom Yazzie locked the front gate and gave Caleb a tired wave as his sedan pulled onto the road. Only Elena stayed working late in the clinic, drowning in paperwork that had piled up during a week when the paperwork had seemed less important than the quiet revolution happening in the quarantine wing. Around 9, she made a fresh pot of coffee and carried 2 mugs down the hallway. She found Caleb exactly where she knew he would be. He was on his stool. His jacket was zipped against the chill. He was not reading. He was just sitting, his hand resting on the gate, and inside the run, Ghost was asleep. Not deeply, not peacefully. His legs twitched. His lips pulled back from his teeth in the phantom snarl of whatever he was dreaming. But he was lying less than 3 feet from the gate, his nose pointing toward Caleb's hand. Elena approached slowly. Her soft-soled shoes were nearly silent on the concrete. He is asleep, she whispered. She said it the way someone might say they had just witnessed a miracle. Because in a way, she had. This dog who had not stopped moving, not stopped trembling, not stopped preparing for the next blow since the moment he arrived, was sleeping 3 feet from a human hand. Just resting, Caleb said. His voice was a low rumble, barely louder than the hum of the fluorescent lights above them. He wakes if I move. Elena handed him the mug. He took it. His fingers were cold and stiff, and they wrapped around the ceramic with a need that was about more than warmth. She leaned against the opposite wall, and for a while neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the buzz of the lights and the occasional muffled bark from the main adoption wing, and the slow rhythm of Ghost breathing. I euthanized 3 dogs today, Elena said. Her voice was steady but thin, stretched over something that was about to break. Not for aggression, Not because they were dangerous, because we are full. We are always full, too old, too sick, too hard to place. I write reports, I give injections, I clean kennels, and then I hold them when they go. She looked into her mug. Sometimes I wonder what we are even doing here. We save 1 in 5 more come in the next morning. It feels useless, like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. The weariness in her voice went beyond physical fatigue. It was the exhaustion of the heart, the specific grinding depletion that comes from caring too much in a world that does not care enough. Caleb recognized it. He had felt it. He had run from it. "You are not alone," he said. The words surprised him. They had come from somewhere he did not control. Elena looked up. In that feeling, he clarified. His gaze drifted to a point on the concrete floor, to a crack that ran from the wall to the base of the gate, a flaw in the foundation that no one had ever bothered to fix. The uselessness. He was quiet for a long time. He drank his coffee. He watched Ghost's sleeping body rise and fall. "I had a partner," Caleb said. His voice dropped so low that Elena had to lean forward to hear him. She leaned without thinking, drawn by the gravity of a confession that had been building pressure for 19 years. "Ranger. He was the best dog I ever knew, the best soldier, the best friend. He could track a target through 5 kilometers of desert in a sandstorm. He loved the work. He loved me, and I loved him more than most people I have known in my life." Elena's eyes softened. "He was your K9 in the war. He was my K9. He was my best friend. He saved my life more times than I can count. I owed him everything." The silence stretched. Caleb's left hand, the one not holding the mug, closed into a fist. He stared at it like he could see something on the knuckles. Blood, dust, the shadow of a choice he could not take back. "When it happened," he said, and his voice changed. It became rough and fractured, like a road breaking apart under weight it was never designed to carry. "The reports said it was unavoidable. An IED, bad luck. The kind of thing that happens over there." He took a breath that shook on the way in. But they were not there. They were not in my head. He looked up, and for the first time Elena saw what he kept hidden. The raw 19-year-old wound that he had carried up the mountain, intended in silence and never allowed to heal, because healing would have felt like forgetting, and forgetting would have felt like betrayal. His eyes were bright. The hard, carved lines of his face were broken open, and behind them was a vulnerability so total and so unguarded that Elena felt her own chest tighten in response. "It was avoidable," he said. His voice cracked, and he did not try to repair it. "I was tired. We were all tired. 20 hours into a patrol in heat that could kill you standing still." Ranger alerted. He gave me the sign. Subtle, but I knew. I knew him better than I knew myself. He told me something was wrong. He squeezed his eyes shut. But I hesitated. A part of me thought maybe he is just hot. Maybe he is tired too. Maybe it is nothing. I second-guessed him. I second-guessed Ranger. His eyes opened, and they were the eyes of a man standing at the edge of a cliff he had been walking toward for 2 decades. I should have pulled back. I should have called the bomb disposal team, but I did not. I gave a bad command. I told him to move forward. Just a few more feet. I sent him into the blast. "Caleb, I got him killed, Elena." The words came out in a voice she barely recognized as the same one that had whispered German commands to a sleeping dog an hour earlier. "I gave a bad command, and I killed my partner. That is the truth. I am the one who is broken. Not this dog. Me." He turned away from her. His shoulders, which had been rigid as bridge cables for 3 days, curved inward. He stared through the chain link at the sleeping shepherd, a man looking into a mirror that showed him not his face but his failure. Elena sat with him for a long time. She did not say it was not your fault. She did not say you did your best. She understood better than most the crushing weight of responsibility, the impossible arithmetic of lives saved versus lives lost. The what-ifs that follow you home from work and sit at the foot of your bed and stare at you in the dark. Finally, she stood. She collected both mugs. "You are not that man anymore, Caleb," she said softly, "and you are the only person who can save this dog. Do not let your past kill him too." She left him alone with the sleeping shepherd and the fluorescent lights and the 19-year-old ghost that had followed him down from the mountain. Her words stayed. They sat in the air of the hallway like smoke. Do not let your past kill him too. She had meant them as comfort, as encouragement, as the kind of thing you say to a man who needs permission to keep going. But in the silence of the quarantine wing with the sleeping doll and the cold concrete and the hum of the lights, the words landed differently. They landed like a verdict. The sound of a truck pulling into the gravel lot the next morning changed everything. It was not Tom's quiet sedan. The crunch of the tires was heavy and aggressive. A county vehicle, its logo stark on the door, slammed to a halt. Rayon Taveros got out. He wore his uniform, but his arm was bound in a heavy white bandage, the hand emerging, swollen and blue. He held a clipboard in his good hand, clutching it to his chest like a shield. His face was pale, his eyes dark with a mixture of anger and a deep, unsettling fear. The moment Ghost saw Ray, the progress of the past days was erased. The dog lunged, a furious, desperate explosion of gray and white, hitting the gate with a deafening rattle, teeth bared, snarling and snapping at the man who was the source of his pain, both past and present. Ray flinched, a sharp, involuntary jerk backward, and that reflexive show of fear seemed to fuel his anger. C. Ray shouted, not to anyone in particular, but to the world at large. "Still a monster." "I told you, Tom." Tom emerged from the office, his face grim. He had clearly been expecting this. "Ray, calm down. You are agitating him." "I am agitating him," Ray's voice cracked. He held up the clipboard. "This is official, Tom. The report is filed. Aggression incident level 4 mandatory review. Our insurance carrier got the report yesterday." He jabbed a finger toward the snarling dog. "They are threatening to drop the entire county contract. Not just the shelter, the entire county. All because of that animal." Tom looked trapped. "Ray, we are making progress. This man, Caleb, he is a veteran handler. The dog is a former military working dog. I do not care if he was a 4-star general." Ray shouted, his eyes wide. "He is a liability. The county board agrees. They held an emergency vote." He thrust the clipboard at Tom. "You have 7 days. That is the order." Caleb had stood up. The legs of his stool scraped against the gravel, a quiet sound that cut through the tension. Ghost, hearing his protector move, fell silent, though his body remained coiled and trembling. 7 days for what Caleb said. His voice was low and it carried. Ray turned on him, his gaze sweeping over Caleb with contempt. 7 days until he is put down. That is the law. Behavioral euthanasia. And I will be the one to sign the paper. It is my right as the victim." He smiled, a thin, bitter expression that held no victory, only pain. He slapped the clipboard against Tom's chest. "My shift starts next Monday. I expect it to be done." He turned, got back in his truck, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust. Tom stared at the paper, his shoulders slumped. Caleb was staring at the kennel where Ghost had retreated to the corner, his failed charge leaving him panting and defeated. The weight of 19 years of Kandahar, of every failure, crashed down on Caleb. A timer, a 7-day deadline, a life he was responsible for slipping through his fingers. He had run from this, and it had found him anyway. "He cannot do that, can he?" Elena said, coming out of the office, her face pale. "He just did." Tom said, his voice flat. He looked at Caleb. "He is right. The county holds the purse strings. My hands are tied. It is a legal order." 7 days, Caleb said. His voice was hollow. "It is not enough time." "Wait," Elena said. She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the official document in Tom's hands. She pointed to a subsection. Listen to me. Both of you, look, it is not just a death warrant. She took the paper from Tom. The goal is not to heal him, she said. That is impossible in 7 days. I read the fine print. She looked Caleb directly in the eye, her voice suddenly strong and clear. The order is for euthanasia unless he can be deemed manageable for transfer. We do not have to make him a pet. We just have to prove he can be controlled. He has to reliably accept a muzzle and walk on a leash without lunging from this kennel run to a transport vehicle. That is the loophole. If we can film that, if we can document that he is manageable, I can legally transfer him to a specialized military working dog sanctuary in Colorado. Tom looked up, a spark of his old captain's mind igniting. The one outside Boulder. Exactly, Elena said. They have specialists, veterinary behaviorists who work with combat dogs. It is a long shot. He will not even let us near the gate with a food bowl, but it is the only shot we have. Caleb looked at Ghost. The impossible, abstract goal of healing vanished. In its place was a concrete, tangible mission. Muzzle, leash, walk. This he understood. This was an operations order. Caleb did not go home that night. The 90-minute round trip up and down the mountain was a luxury of time he could no longer afford. He slept in the cab of his truck, reclined against the worn bench seat, waking every few hours as the temperature dropped his bones aching. The first thing he did when the sun touched the peaks was get his stool. He was intensifying the therapy. He moved the stool closer, 4 feet from the gate, now well within the dog's recognized boundary. Ghost's reaction to this was electric. The low growl was constant. He paced in tight, frantic circles, but he would not lunge. Caleb's calm was a shield the dog's aggression could not penetrate. Then came the muzzle. A black basket-style tactical muzzle, the kind used in military working dog training. Caleb had attached it to a simple wooden pole, not as a weapon, but as an extension, a tool for desensitization. He sat on his stool, his book unopened in his lap, and slowly, quietly pushed the pole through the chain link until the muzzle rested on the concrete 6 inches inside the run. Ghost's reaction was immediate. He scrambled to the back wall, his claws scraping on the floor. A high-pitched, terrified whine escaped his throat. He stared at the muzzle, his entire body trembling. This was the tool of his abuser. This was the shape that preceded pain. Caleb held it there, motionless. For an hour, it was a battle not of aggression, but of patience versus trauma. By midday, Ghost's fear had exhausted him. He was still in the corner, but his head was down. He would watch the muzzle, then look at Caleb. Muzzle, man, muzzle, man. His traumatized brain was trying to connect the two. The muzzle was terror. But the man was liver treats. The man was a low, calm voice. The man was the first human who had not tried to hurt him. This was the conflict that Caleb had to win. He slowly pulled the muzzle back out. The moment it vanished, the tension in Ghost's body eased by half. Then Caleb did the second hardest thing. He put his bare left hand against the chain-link gate. Ghost crept forward. He stretched his neck out, his black nose twitching just an inch from the wire. He was sniffing the hand. Leather, pine smoke, salt, and beneath it the faint warm smell of a body that meant no harm. Ghost's tongue darted out and licked the wire where Caleb's hand rested. Then, terrified by his own bravery, the dog scrambled back to the corner. Caleb let out a breath he did not know he was holding. He stayed for 2 more hours, his hand on the gate, a silent promise. That night, Elena found him in the quarantine wing again. She brought coffee. She brought something else, too. Tom told me something today, Elena said, leaning against the wall. About Ray. About why he is the way he is. Caleb did not turn from the gate. Ghost was resting nearby, not asleep, but the closest thing to calm the dog had managed in Caleb's presence. About 5 years ago, Elena said, her voice low, before Tom was director. Ray was the lead officer on a rescue call. A pit mix owner swore the dog was just scared. Ray went in. The dog got him, not a bite. A mauling. Caleb's hand on the gate did not move. 60 stitches in his leg. Elena continued. 40 in his arm. Nerve damage. He was out of work for 8 months. The doctors told him he would never have full use of his right hand again. He proved them wrong, but it took everything he had. She paused. The dog, Tom said the dog was just scared. But scared dogs, abused dogs, they are the most dangerous. Ray came back to work. Everyone called him a hero. But he has never been the same. He does not trust instinct anymore. He trusts rules. He trusts procedures. He looks at Ghost and he does not see a veteran. He sees the animal that almost ended his career. He sees a monster because that is the only way he can make sense of what happened to him. Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He is trapped, same as the dog." Elena looked at him. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly what he is." The days blurred together, 5 remaining, then 4. Caleb sleeping in his truck, rising with the sun, sitting on the stool with his hand on the wire, and the muzzle on the pole and the clock in his gut ticking down toward a deadline that would not bend. On the 3rd day before the deadline, something shifted. Ghost crept to the gate in the early morning closer than he had ever been, and he did not just lick the wire. He pressed his nose directly against Caleb's fingers. The wet, cold leather of his nose against warm human skin. Contact. Real contact. For less than 2 seconds before he jerked away. But it had happened. Caleb did not react. He kept his hand perfectly still. He kept his breathing even. But inside his chest, something that had been frozen for 19 years cracked. That night, Caleb did not sleep in his truck. He could not sleep at all. The confession to Elena had not freed him. It had only shown him the depth of his prison. He was building trust with Ghost on a foundation of guilt, projecting his own failure onto the dog, reaching through the chain link with hands that carried the weight of a lie he had told himself so many times it had become the architecture of his identity. He needed to know. He needed the truth. Not the story he had been telling himself for 19 years. The real truth. He drove to the 24-hour gas station on the interstate junction, an island of harsh fluorescent light in the middle of the dark desert. He parked by the air pump. He walked to the battered payphone on the back wall. He pulled his wallet from his back pocket. Behind a flap of worn fabric was a small piece of paper folded so many times the creases had nearly cut through. He had not looked at it since 2005. One name, one number. Danny. His fingers were stiff, clumsy with cold and with the fear that was older and deeper than the cold. He dropped the first coin and listened to it roll across the floor into the darkness under the magazine rack. He did not pick it up. He pulled another, fed it into the slot, lifted the heavy receiver, punched in the numbers with a hand that was shaking so badly he had to use his index finger because his thumb could not find the buttons. Once, twice. On the 3rd ring, a voice answered, thick and rough and blurred with sleep. "Yeah, who is this?" Caleb leaned his forehead against the cold metal of the phone housing. The fluorescent tube above him buzzed and flickered. A moth circled it in a tight, desperate orbit. "Danny, it is Caleb. Caleb Mercer." The silence that followed was absolute. 5 seconds, then 10. Then Danny Kowalski spoke again, and his voice was completely different. Cold, sharp, vibrating with the kind of anger that does not burn hot, but burns steady like a coal that has been glowing in the dark for 2 decades. "Caleb, you are alive. Danny, I need to." "You need what?" "You vanished, just disappeared. No funeral, no memorial, not a phone call, not a letter. We thought you were dead. For 3 years we thought you were dead. Then someone saw your truck at a gas station in New Mexico, and we found out you were just gone, just hiding. Do you understand what that did to us? You are right, I am sorry. I was not. You were not what? What about the rest of us? What about the team? What about me, Caleb? I carried that box. I carried his box on my shoulder at Lackland in the rain. And you were not there. I'm calling about Ranger. Another pause. The anger fractured, and behind it was something older. Grief crystallized by 19 years into something harder than stone. Ranger, Danny said. What about Ranger? I need to say it. I need you to know that it was my fault. I hesitated. I sent him forward. I gave a bad command. I killed him, Danny. I killed our dog. He braced himself. He had been waiting 19 years for this confirmation, for Danny to agree, to say, yes, you did, to give voice to the verdict that Caleb had pronounced on himself 10,000 times in the silence of his cabin. What he got instead was a sound he did not recognize, a choking, strangled noise that was not agreement. It was disbelief. What Danny said, what are you talking about? I hesitated. I should have pulled back. I was tired and I sent him forward and is that what you have been telling yourself? Danny's voice was rising, sharp, frantic. 19 years. Is that why you disappeared? You think it was your fault. You think you gave a bad command. It is the truth. No, the word was a detonation. No, that is not what happened. Are you insane? You think you killed him? Danny, you saw nothing. You were concussed. You were bleeding from both ears. You were medevaced within 4 minutes, and you never came back. You never asked. You never called. You just decided it was your fault, and you disappeared, and you left the rest of us to deal with it. Caleb's hand was shaking so badly, the receiver was tapping against the metal housing. Listen to me, Danny said. His voice dropped, thick and raw. Ranger alerted. You called it in. You were right. You were correct. But the IED, the one he alerted on it, was not the real threat. It was a decoy, Caleb. A setup. Bait for the EOD team. What? There was a secondary device, a pressure plate buried 10 feet from the decoy. It was aimed at us, at the team. Ranger alerted on the first one, the decoy, but then he caught the scent of the second one. He knew Caleb. He knew what it was. No, he did not move forward because of your command. He moved because of me. Danny's voice broke. Because I stepped off the path. I was moving toward the decoy to mark it. I was walking right onto the pressure plate, and Ranger saw it. He saw what I was about to do. He lunged. He hit me full in the chest. He knocked me sideways off the plate. He took the full blast. The receiver was shaking against the metal. He saved my life, Caleb. Danny was weeping now, the sound raw and terrible. He did not die because of your command. He died because of mine, because of my mistake. He died saving me. He was a hero, and he died a hero, and you were not there to know it because you ran. You ran and you left me to carry that story alone for 19 years. The world tilted. 19 years. 19 years of self-imposed exile, of silence and solitude, and the crushing, suffocating guilt of a failure that had never happened. His guilt was not wrong. It was just aimed at the wrong target. He was not guilty of a bad command. He was not guilty of killing Ranger. He was guilty of vanishing, of abandoning his team, of leaving Danny Kowalski to carry the truth alone. Danny, Caleb said. His voice was hollow. I did not know, I'm sorry. Yeah, Danny said. His breathing was ragged. That is because you ran. You ran, Caleb, and you left us to honor him without you. A long pause. I am glad you are not dead, Danny said finally. I really am, but I have to go. A soft click. The line went dead. Caleb stood in the harsh white light of the gas station with the dead receiver pressed against his ear. He stood there for a long time. The moth continued its orbit above him, circling the light it could not reach. He was not free. He had not been unburdened. He had been handed a different weight. He was not a failure. He was a coward. Ranger had not died because of a bad command. Ranger had died saving Danny. Ranger had died a hero. And Caleb had taken his grief and wrapped it in a false narrative and used that narrative as justification for disappearing from every person who had ever needed him. He hung up the phone. He looked at his hands. He had to go back. Not to save Ghost from a ghost. Not to atone for a mistake that never happened. But to stop running. To be present. To do the only thing he had ever been truly good at. Take care of the guy in front of him, not the one behind. He arrived at the shelter as the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of purple and ash. The parking lot was empty. 3 days left on the clock. He walked to the quarantine wing with a different weight in his step. Not heavier, not lighter, rearranged. The crushing guilt of the bad command was gone. It had been a lie. In its place was a different, sharper grief, the grief of cowardice. Ranger had died a hero, saving Danny, saving the team. And Caleb had not stayed to honor that. He had not stood with his teammates. He had taken his confusion and his concussed, half-conscious memory of the explosion and fashioned from it a story of personal failure that allowed him to do the one thing his broken mind needed most: disappear. He heard Ghost stir before he turned the corner, a low, warning growl, but underneath it something new, a small sound almost inaudible, a whimper that rose at the end like a question. The dog had heard the truck. The dog had recognized the engine. And somewhere inside the fortress of his terror, Ghost was asking a question he had never asked before. "Are you coming back?" Caleb stopped at the key hook by the door. Tom had given him the key after the 7-day order was issued. He lifted it off the hook. He did not pick up the stool. He did not reach for his book. He walked to the gate of Ghost Run with nothing in his hands. Ghost scrambled to his feet. His eyes went wide. Every previous day had followed the same pattern. The man arrived. The man sat. The man was still. The man was safe because the man was predictable. Today, the man was not sitting. Today, the man was standing at the gate and his hand was reaching for the lock and the pattern was breaking. Ghost lunged. He hit the gate with his front paws. He barked. Deep. Frantic. His teeth snapped against the chain link. "Do not come in here. I will kill you if you come in here." Caleb put the key in the padlock. The click of the mechanism opening echoed down the hallway. Ghost barking went higher, more desperate. Caleb slid the bolt. He opened the gate just wide enough to step through. He stepped inside. He pulled the gate closed behind him and latched it shut. The metallic snap of the latch was like a gunshot. Ghost screamed. It was a high, thin, shredding sound torn from the deepest part of an animal who had been beaten and broken and cornered so many times that the arrival of a human inside his space could mean only one thing. He scrambled backward, his back slamming into the far wall. He pressed himself into the corner. His lips were pulled all the way back from his teeth. His body was shaking so hard the chain link behind him was vibrating. Caleb did not move. He stood with his back to the gate, giving the dog the entire run. He did not crouch. He did not make himself small. He just stood. A man who had stopped performing. A man who had nothing left to project because every projection had been stripped away in a gas station at 3 in the morning. Ghost was seeing him clearly for the first time. Over the past days, the dog had been reading this man through the filter of chain link cataloging his scent. Even through the barrier, Ghost had smelled something on him. A current of tension. A hum of guilt. The chemical signature of a man carrying something he could not put down. That unresolved vibration had kept Ghost from fully trusting him. Because unpredictable humans are dangerous humans. This man was different. The tension was gone. The guilt was gone. Replaced by something heavier, sadder, but stable, solid. The man smelled like grief, but it was a clean grief washed and wrung out and hung in the cold air to dream. The restless, dangerous energy was gone. This man was not a threat. This man was an anchor. The snarling faltered. The lips came down over the teeth. The growl dropped from a roar to a rumble to a vibration so low it was almost subsonic. Ghost's ears were still pinned. His body was still pressed into the corner, but his head came up. His amber eyes locked onto Caleb's face, and in those eyes was the crack in the wall, the moment when a terrified creature considers the possibility that this human might be different from every human who came before. Caleb lowered himself to the concrete, not into a handler's crouch. He sank to his knees, both knees. He put his hands on his thighs. He let his shoulders drop. Total vulnerability. He was a hero, Caleb said. His voice was low and rough. Ghost's head tilted. The growling stopped. In its place came a thin, anxious whine. His name was Ranger. He was the best dog I ever knew, the best soldier, the best friend. I told everyone I got him killed. I told myself that story for 19 years. I climbed a mountain and I hid, and I built a life around that story. He paused. He breathed. But I did not give a bad command. The truth is worse than that. Ranger saw what I did not see. He saw a second device. He saw my friend walking onto the trigger plate, and he did what he was born to do. He threw himself between the bomb and the man. He saved Danny's life. He died a hero. Ghost was whining steadily now. His ears had come partially forward, and I ran. I ran from his memory. I ran from my team. I left Danny to carry that truth alone for 19 years. I let Ranger's legacy rot. I was trapped Ghost, trapped under that lie for 19 years. He looked at his hands on his thighs. We have both been trapped, haven't we, soldier? Me by a lie. You by whatever those men did to you. By the thunder, by the fists, by the chain and the cage in the world that used you up and threw you away. He raised his eyes and looked at the dog. But today we get out. Both of us. Today we stop running. Ghost's body began to change. The rigid spring-loaded tension began to release. Not all at once. Like watching ice melt. A slow molecular relaxation that started in his hindquarters and moved forward through his spine and his shoulders and his neck until his whole body settled lower closer to the concrete. He took one step. His claws clicked softly on the floor. Then another, belly low, each paw placed with the deliberation of a creature crossing a minefield. He stopped just outside of Caleb's reach. His black nose extended. It twitched. It read the air between them, reading the story written in sweat and adrenaline and dried tears and the faint scent of a gas station payphone and cheap coffee and cold night air. Caleb did not move. He did not extend his hand. He simply existed. Ghost took the last step. He stretched his long gray neck forward, and then in a gesture that contained more trust and more courage than any act of heroism Caleb had ever witnessed on any battlefield, the dog pressed his head against Caleb's chest, hard. He drove his broad skull into the hollow below Caleb's collarbone, and he pressed as if trying to push through the leather jacket and the flannel shirt and the skin and the ribs and reach whatever was inside. He was anchoring himself to the first solid thing he had found in a world that had been nothing but quicksand. Caleb's breath caught. He closed his eyes. He raised his hands and cupped the shepherd's broad head, his fingers sinking into the thick, rough fur behind the ears. And he held him, the way you hold something that might break, the way you hold something that is already broken and you are trying to keep the pieces together. For the first time in 19 years, Caleb Mercer wept. He wept for Ranger's sacrifice, for Danny's loneliness, for the 19 years he had lost to a lie. He held the bow, and the dog held him. And in the cold, quiet hallway of the Taos County Animal Shelter, two veterans, two soldiers who had been broken by war and abandoned by the world that sent them to fight it, began the long, slow work of putting each other back together. They stayed that way for a long time. When Caleb finally opened his eyes, the light had changed. The sun had moved. Ghost was still pressed against his chest, but the desperate pressure had eased into something steadier. The dog's breathing was slow. His eyes were half closed. His body, for the first time since Caleb had known him, was not trembling. Caleb spent the rest of that day inside the run. He introduced the muzzle with infinite patience and zero expectation. Ghost recoiled from it the first time, the second time, the fifth time. But each time Caleb presented it from the same posture, the same stillness, the same calm, and each time Ghost's recoil was shorter, his recovery faster. By late afternoon, Ghost was wearing the muzzle. Not comfortably, his body was tense and his eyes were wide, but he was wearing it, and he was standing beside Caleb connected by a short leash and by something much stronger than leather and metal. Elena watched from the doorway. She was crying. "We can film it tomorrow morning," she said. "He can walk. He can wear the muzzle. We can prove he is manageable for transfer. We can beat the deadline." Caleb looked at Ghost. The dog looked back. And in the shepherd's amber eyes, Caleb saw something new. Not trust exactly. Trust would take months, but the willingness to consider trust. The door cracked open. He drove home that night, to his cabin, to his mountain. With real sleep in a bed for the first time in a week. He would be back at dawn. The drive up the mountain was strange. The air was heavy, thick, and oppressive yellowish green that pressed down on the truck like a hand. There was no wind. The trees were motionless. The birds were silent. It was the kind of deep, unnatural stillness that precedes a violent rupture. Caleb was heating a can of soup on the wood stove when the sky broke apart. The first crack of thunder was not a rumble. It was a detonation, a sharp, concussive blast that shook the cabin's windows in their frames. It sounded exactly like a mortar round. Caleb dropped the spoon. He was on the floor before the spoon hit the boards, his back against the wall. His head covered his body, braced for the shockwave. Miles away inside the concrete walls of the quarantine wing, the same sound struck Ghost like a physical blow. The walls amplified it. The echo multiplied it. The thunder became artillery, became mortar, became the sound that meant run or die. Ghost launched himself at the gate whose latch had been damaged by days of desperate assaults and repaired only temporarily by Tom, with a bolt that was not rated for the force about to be applied to it. First impact. The latch held. Second impact. The bolt bent. Third impact. 90 pounds of combat-trained muscle hit the gate like a battering ram, and the metal shrieked, and the latch tore free, and the gate swung open. Ghost was through it before the echo of the thunder had faded. He ran down the hallway. He hit the front door, locked. He spun, found the large supply hatch in the clinic, clawed through it, tumbled into the night, and ran. Into the rain, into the wind, into the full howling chaos of the storm. He was not running toward anything. He was running from the war that had never ended inside his head. Dawn came clean and cold. The storm had scrubbed the valley and left behind a sky so pale it looked like it had never known a cloud. But the ground was wreckage. Rayon Tiveros arrived at the shelter at 7. He saw the bent gate hanging from one hinge before he even left his truck. He saw the bloody paw prints on the concrete. He saw the shattered supply hatch. In his chest, in the place where 5 years ago, a dog that everyone said was just scared had torn into his arm and his leg and left him with 60 stitches and nerve damage and a fear that woke him every night at 3 in the morning. Something cold and certain clicked into place. He reached for his county radio. "Dispatch, this is on Taveros 14. I have a 1031. Aggressive shepherd military working dog escaped the Taos County shelter during the storm. He is loose. He is dangerous. He is a high-risk public threat. I am armed and I am initiating containment." He picked up his rifle, chambered around, and drove toward the foothills. The phone in Caleb's cabin rang at 6:12. He grabbed it. "He is gone, Caleb." Elena's voice was high and fractured. "The storm. The thunder. He broke the gate. He is out there, and Ray is already gone, and he has his rifle. Caleb, he is going to kill him." Caleb was pulling on his boots before she finished. "Where would he go?" Elena said. "Up," Caleb said. "Away from the noise. He will look for a defensible position." He knew exactly where. The old Sonora mine. abandoned since the 1970s, a maze of collapsed tunnels and rusted equipment in deep fissures in the rock, the perfect fortress for a terrified soldier looking for a foxhole. Meet me at the trailhead. He saw them at the trailhead, two White County trucks, Elena's small sedan, and Ray with two younger officers flanking him, both looking nervous. Ray was rigid, his jaw clenched, his eyes flat and far away. He held his county-issued rifle at low ready. His injured hand gripped the forestock, the pain visible in the whiteness of his knuckles. Elena was standing in front of him, arms outstretched, tears streaming. Ray, you cannot do this. Tom has not signed off. I have every authority I need. That animal mauled me. Now it is loose in a community with schools and livestock and children. I am not waiting for paperwork. Get out of my way, Elena. He is not a monster. He is a veteran. He is just scared. So am I. Ray shouted and the mask cracked. So am I, and I am not letting what happened to me happen to some kid walking to school. He pushed past her. He chambered the round. The metallic slide and click was final. Put it down, Ray. Caleb's voice cut through the morning air. It was not loud, but it had the authority of a man who had spent his life giving commands that could not be questioned. Ray spun. Caleb stepped out of his truck. Tall, lean, the old brown leather jacket unzipped, the collar of his flannel shirt visible. His face was carved from stone. I said, put the rifle down. You stay out of this, old man. You are the reason that thing is loose. He is not a threat. He is a soldier. He is trapped, and he is calling for help. That is not what I hear, Ray said, his voice shaking. That is what they sound like right before they tear into you. Then you should recognize the sound of a man giving you a lawful order. A dark sedan pulled into the lot, blocking the trail completely. Tom Yazzie stepped out. He was not the weary shelter director. He was wearing an old, dark windbreaker with faded letters across the chest. Teos P.D. retired. He stood to his full height and walked between Caleb and Ray, with the stride of a man who had spent 20 years being the last voice of reason in rooms full of frightened people with weapons. Ray, Tom said, and his voice was a command, I know what you are feeling. I know what you are remembering, but today is not that day, and this dog is not that dog. You are compromised. Give me the rifle, Tom. I have the authority to... No, you do not. Tom's voice snapped. You have a recommendation. I am the director of this facility. That animal is shelter property under my jurisdiction until that deadline expires or until I sign the order, and I have not signed it. He pointed a finger at Ray's chest. You are hunting my property. You are threatening a civilian, and you are disobeying a direct order from your supervisor. Stand down. The standoff lasted 12 seconds. 12 seconds during which Ray Ontiveros fought the hardest battle of his life, not against the dog on the mountain, but against the 5-year-old memory of teeth sinking into his flesh. The fear wanted him to raise the rifle. The fear wanted him to fire. But Ray Ontiveros had not spent 15 years in county service by being a slave to his fear. Underneath the trauma and the scars and the nightly terrors, he believed in the rules. And the rules were being spoken to him now by a man whose authority he had never questioned. He lowered the rifle. Tom turned to Caleb. You know where the dog is. I know where he will be hiding. The Sonora mine. Go get him. Tom looked at his watch. I am giving you 24 hours. Go get your soldier, Caleb. Caleb looked at Elena, who was sobbing with relief. He looked at Tom, who gave him a sharp nod. He looked at Ray, who was staring at the ground. Then he turned and faced the mountain, and he began to climb. The trail was slick, and the air smelled of wet pine and crushed sage. Caleb moved with purpose. He was 54 years old, but he climbed with the economical grace of a man who understood the mountain. The signs of Ghost Passage were everywhere. Deep, disorganized paw prints in the wet red earth toes splayed wide. Broken branches, tufts of gray and white fur caught on thorns. This was not an escape. This was a rout. He crested the last ridge and the Sonora mine spread out before him. Rusted equipment, collapsed timber frames, dark openings in the rock. Ghost Caleb called. His voice was low and calm. Easy, soldier. I am here. Silence. Then from below a growl so deep it sounded like the earth itself was warning him away. It was coming from a fissure in the rock, a collapsed mine entrance, narrow and deep. Caleb moved to the edge and looked down. Two amber eyes stared back up at him from the shadows. Ghost was wedged at the bottom. He had been running in the dark and gone over the edge. His rear right leg was bent at an angle no leg should bend, caught in a tangle of old rebar and loose rock. He was trapped. When he saw the silhouette of a human against the sky, he lunged. He snapped at the air. His teeth clacked together. He was cornered and injured and prepared to fight to the death. Caleb did not see a monster. He saw the end of a soldier's road. 20 yards along the rim, the rock sloped steeply into a narrow chute of loose shale that led to a ledge about 5 feet above where Ghost was trapped. Treacherous, barely passable. The only way. Caleb sat on the edge, dug his heels in, and began to slide. The rock scraped against his palms and tore through the leather of his jacket's sleeves. He hit the ledge hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. Ghost went berserk below him, snapping at the rock walls, at his own trapped leg, at the new threat in his prison. Easy, Caleb gasped. I am not here to hurt you. He sat on the ledge. He let the silence stretch. He let Ghost's fury burn itself out. The snarls subsided into a low, desperate whine. The dog was looking at him. Not with rage, with exhaustion. Caleb looked at his left hand. The slide had torn the palm open. Blood dripped onto the stone. He pulled a small canvas first aid kit from his jacket and began to slowly, methodically bandage his own wound. Ghost watched, head low, eyes tracking every move. He was a hero, Caleb said quietly. Ranger, my partner. He did not die because of me. He died because he saw a boom aimed at our team, and he threw himself on it. He saved Danny's life. He saved all of us. And I could not live with that. Not with the sacrifice, not with the heroism. I could not stand being the man who was saved, so I turned myself into the man who failed. Guilt was easier than gratitude. Punishment was easier than grace. He finished wrapping his hand. He looked down at the shepherd. We have been trapped in the same hole, soldier. Both of us. But today, we get out. He stood on the ledge. He unbuckled his thick leather belt and slid it free. He fashioned a loop with the buckle, creating a makeshift slip lead. He lowered himself off the ledge, dropping the last 5 feet to the floor of the fissure. Ghost snarled but did not lunge. He was too weak, too hurt. Caleb slipped the belt loop over Ghost's head and onto his neck. Ghost flinched but allowed it. I see the problem, Caleb said, looking at the trapped leg. The rebar was twisted, but the rock was loose. He grabbed the largest piece and heaved it aside. Ghost yelped as the pressure released. The leg was free, but would not bear weight. I know, Caleb said. I know it hurts, but we are going up. At the far end of the fissure, the rock fall had created a steep, narrow, sloping path, almost vertical. But it was a way out. This is the hard part, Caleb said. Together. We go together. He began to climb. He looked back. Ghost was standing on 3 legs, whimpering. Caleb went back down. He knelt beside the and put his torn, bandaged hand on the broad gray head. You are a soldier. You are a hero. You will not die in this hole. Voraus. Forward. Ghost looked at him. He looked at the slope. He put his front paws on the first rock. He scrambled his injured leg, dragging a cry of pain escaping. Voraus, Caleb said again, climbing just ahead using the belt as a guide. It was an agonizing ascent. 90 pounds of dead weight and adrenaline and pain. They slipped. Rocks tumbled. Ghost cried out as his legs struck stone. But he kept climbing, following the voice, trusting the command. Caleb grabbed the final edge and hauled himself over. He turned, braced his feet, and pulled. Ghost gave a final desperate lunge, his front paws clawing at the rim, and collapsed on flat, solid ground. Sides heaving, mouth open. He was out. Caleb unclipped his belt and collapsed next to the dog. Back against a boulder, jacket torn, hands bleeding. Ghost crawled the last 2 feet and put his head in Caleb's lap. He began to lick the blood from the torn bandage on Caleb's hand. Gently, rhythmically. Caleb sat there with the weight of the dog's head in his lap and the vast blue sky above him. And he let the dog lick his hand, and he let the sun warm his face, and he felt for the first time in 19 years, real peace. Not the absence of pain, not the silence of his cabin, not the emptiness he had mistaken for calm. The kind of peace that comes only when you stop running and turn around and face the thing that has been chasing you and discover that it was not trying to destroy you. It was trying to bring you home. The walk down was slow. Caleb used his belt as a makeshift harness, looping it under Ghost's chest to support his weight. The shepherd leaned against Caleb's leg and limped one agonizing step at a time. But he did not pull. He did not fight. He walked beside the man who had climbed down into his hole and carried him out. When they emerged from the tree line onto the flat gravel of the trailhead, Elena saw them first. A sound escaped her that was half sob and half prayer. Tom spun around. His professional mask slipped. They were a hard sight. Caleb caked in mud and dried blood, his jacket torn, his flannel ripped at the shoulder, and ghost gray and white fur matted back leg held completely off the ground, but his head high and his eyes forward, and his entire being focused on the man beside him. He was not a monster. He was a paw walking on a slack lead beside a man he had chosen to follow. Rayon Taveros was standing apart, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his face pale and unreadable. He watched them approach, and his eyes went to the dog's leg, to the limp, to the pain, then to something no one else could see. He saw a dog walking calmly, a dog in pain, a dog who was not lunging, not snarling, an animal that was scared and hurt and following a man it trusted. He saw what he had not been able to see before. He saw himself. 5 years ago, on the floor of a house with a dog on top of him, he had been scared and hurt and desperate, and he had survived because someone had pulled the animal off and carried him out. And now someone had gone into a hole in a mountain and done the same thing for this dog. Ray did not speak. He walked to his county truck. He opened the side panel toolbox. He pulled out a large orange professional medical kit. He walked toward them and stopped 10 feet away. He did not try to get closer. He looked at Caleb, then at the dog. Then he placed the kit on the gravel between them. "That leg needs attention now," Ray said. His voice was clipped and professional. "Nerve damage if that joint is not stabilized. My kit has everything you need." He looked at Ghost one last time. A long, complicated look that held the entire 5-year war between the man he was and the man his fear wanted him to be. Then he turned and walked back to his truck and leaned against the door and said nothing else. It was enough. It was his concession, not to the dog, not to Caleb, to himself, to the possibility that a scared animal is not always a dangerous one, that what happened to him did not have to happen to everyone. Tom moved in. Elena let us get him to the clinic. Carefully, Caleb knelt. Ghost licked his face. "It is okay, soldier. These are friends. You are safe." He unclipped his belt and handed the dog over. He watched them lift the 90-pound shepherd into a transport carrier with a gentleness that made his chest ache. He watched them drive toward the clinic. He was left standing alone at the trailhead, covered in blood and dirt, his jacket destroyed, his hands raw. Tom came back with a first aid kit. "Your hand," Tom said. Caleb looked at his palm as if seeing it for the first time. He nodded and let Tom clean and rewrap the wound. "That was the bravest thing I have ever seen," Tom said, quietly taping the gauze. "And I do not mean the climb. I mean what you did in that kennel, and what you did for Ray just now, letting him see the dog walk. Caleb looked over at Ray, who was still leaning against his truck. He is trapped too, Caleb said. Same as the dog. Yeah, Tom said. He finished the bandage. He looked at Caleb, at the torn jacket and the flannel shirt and the face of a man who had been gone from the world for 19 years and was standing on the edge of coming back. There is a cottage, Tom said, nodding toward the back of the shelter property where a small stucco building sat under a massive old cottonwood tree. It has not been used in years. Used to be the groundskeeper's quarters. The plumbing works. The roof is solid. Caleb looked at it. It is not much. Tom continued, but it is quiet. It is here. And it is yours if you want it. He paused. Elena has a list. 3 other dogs in the back wing. A hound that will not let anyone near it. A shepherd mix from a fighting ring. A terrier that has been returned 4 times. Dogs I have been saving for a miracle. He looked Caleb in the eye. I think you are the miracle, Caleb. The cottage is yours. The job, if you want it, is to just keep doing what you are doing. Caleb looked at the cottage. He looked at the clinic where he could hear Elena's voice low and soothing. He thought of his cabin on the mountain. The one room, the one window, the wood stove and the silence and the empty years. He had built that cabin as a fortress. He had climbed 9,000 feet to escape the man he used to be. But the truth was that the man he used to be was not a failure. He was a handler, a soldier, someone built to take care of dogs who had been broken by the same wars that broke the men who served beside them. And for 19 years, he had been hiding that gift in a cabin in the sky, letting it waste, letting it die, the slow death of unused purpose. Ranger had not died because Caleb failed. Ranger had died because Ranger was a hero. And the only way to honor a hero is to live a life worthy of the sacrifice. I will need to go get my things, Caleb said. Tom nodded. Take the day. We will be here when you get back. Caleb drove up the mountain one last time. He packed his clothes into a canvas bag. He took the stove tools and the first aid kit in the old paperback with the missing cover. He left the rest. The cabin would stand empty. The wind would blow through it, and eventually the mountain would take it back the way mountains take back everything built by men who are trying to hide. He drove down with the windows open and the cold air rushing through the bone and the sun on his face. Ghost was out of surgery when Caleb arrived. The leg was set. The prognosis was good. He would limp for the rest of his life, but he would walk. He would run. He would live. Caleb knelt beside the recovery kennel. Ghost was lying on a thick blanket, his rear legs splinted and wrapped in bright white bandage. His eyes were half closed, still foggy from sedation. But when Caleb put his hand against the wire, the dog's eyes opened fully. His tail moved. Just once. A single, slow, deliberate wag that traveled from the tip to the base and sent a ripple through his entire exhausted body. Caleb pressed his forehead against the wire. I am not going anywhere, soldier, he said. We are home. 6 weeks later, the stucco cottage was unrecognizable. The broken fence had been replaced. The yard was clean. Wood smoke curled from the chimney. On the porch, in a patch of winter sun, Ghost lay sleeping. His coat was thick and clean and glossy. His rear leg bore a thin scar and gave him a slight stiff gait that slowed him on stairs but did not stop him. His head rested on his paws. His ears twitched in his sleep, tracking sounds that only he could hear. He was not scanning the rooftops. He was listening to the wind. Inside the cottage, Caleb was on the phone. The voice on the other end belonged to Danny Kowalski, and it was warm and rough and full of the cautious joy of 2 men learning how to be friends again after 19 years of silence. They talked every Sunday now, sometimes about Ranger, sometimes about nothing, sometimes about the program. The program was Elena's idea. She had written the grant proposal on her kitchen table at 2 in the morning. She called it Second Watch. Pair broken dogs with broken soldiers. Put them in a room together. Give them time and silence in the dignity of being seen by someone who understands. Danny had made the first donation, a check in a plain envelope with a single line on the memo, for Ranger. Tom had cleared the quarantine wing and converted it into a training space. 3 kennels, 3 days. A hound mix found chained to a tree, a shepherd mix pulled from a fighting ring. A terrier returned 4 times because he bit anyone who reached for him too quickly. 3 dogs the system had given up on. 3 veterans who had given up on themselves. Caleb did not run a program. He did not give speeches. He did what he had always done. He sat on a 3-legged stool with a book he was not reading, and he waited, with the patience of a man who understood that trust is not built. It is grown. And growth requires the one thing the world is least willing to give: time. On a Tuesday morning in early December, Caleb stood by the cottage fence watching Ghost investigate a rabbit hole with the focused curiosity of a dog who was remembering what it felt like to be interested in the world instead of terrified of it. Elena came walking up with a clipboard and 2 mugs of coffee. She handed him one without asking. The county board approved the expansion, she said. 3 more runs. Tom got the funding. Caleb nodded. He sipped the coffee. Danny called this morning, Elena said. He is driving out next month. He wants to meet Ghost. Caleb looked at her, at the dark hair and the brown eyes and the stubborn set of her jaw. She was not just a vet tech anymore. She was a program director. He looked at Ghost, who had abandoned the rabbit hole and was walking towards him across the yard. His gait was uneven, the stiff rear leg giving him a rolling, unhurried stride. But his head was high. His ears were up. His tail carried a low, steady wag that was not excitement, but something deeper: contentment. Ghost reached the fence and pushed his head through the gap between the rails. Caleb put his hand on the broad gray skull and felt the warmth and the steady breathing and the solid living weight of an animal who had been saved from a hole in the ground by a man who had been saved from a hole of his own. He was not the silent man on the mountain anymore. He was not the ghost who bought supplies 4 times a year and disappeared. He was just Caleb, a handler, a veteran, a man with a jig and a cottage and a ma and a phone that rang on Sundays, and a young woman who brought him coffee without asking, and a friend 2,000 miles away who was driving out next month to meet the dog, who had done for Caleb what Ranger had done for Danny: saved his life, not by taking a bullet, but by standing still long enough for someone to find him. Yeah, Caleb said. His voice was calm and stared in, and for the first time in 19 years it was full, not loud, not confident, not healed, full. The way a glass is full, the way a room is full, the way a life is full when it finally contains something besides silence. I am ready.